My name is Bill Cole, and I'm head of policy at Professionals in International Trade, and I'm the international trade partner at BDO Australia. Today's event has been curated in collaboration with the University of South Australia and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I thank them for their assistance and contribution. Before we start with the formal introduction of our topic and speakers for today's webinar, I'd like to make some comments on Professionals in International Trade organisation. For the attendees who don't know us, I'd like to briefly introduce some of the broad ideas that are put forward by Professionals in International Trade. It was founded in 2015. Professionals in International Trade is a professional association of people working in international trade in Australia and New Zealand, created to connect and support professionals who share a common interest in international trade, investment, business and foreign affairs. It provides opportunities for members to connect with like-minded professionals, foster strategic business partnerships, strengthen international trade and investment knowledge, and encourage cross-cultural exchange. I invite you all to consider becoming members of this vibrant organisation. Turning to this afternoon's topics, the event will proceed as follows. I will make some introductory comments about Australia's global supply chains. There will then be a handover to Professor Nancy Arthur, the Dean of Research at the University of South Australia, to introduce our guest speakers from the Productivity Commission, Catherine and Jonathan. Catherine and Jonathan will then present findings from the Productivity Commission's report on vulnerable supply chains. We will then go to a panel discussion composed of businesses who engage in international supply chains, and they will be moderated by Susan Freeman, also from the University of South Australia. Mr. Brian Clark, Director Trade and International Affairs at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, will provide a summary and concluding remarks after that. To wrap up, Bin Ray will introduce the breakout rooms, and all of the participants will be allocated a breakout room where further discussions and questions will be answered. I think it's true to say that when considering the idea of global supply chains, there's a lot of emphasis on the physical movements of goods and services, and I think that's absolutely a valid approach to considering the concept, certainly in the COVID-19 environment. However, of course, it's broader than that. It really refers to an ecosystem of businesses, connectivity, the exchange of goods and services, the production of intermediate and final items and their distribution. So the web, if you like, that weaves itself around the idea of supply chain is intricate. It also has other attributes such as scale, specific application, general, sectoral and economy-wide impacts. So the concept of supply chain can be applied loosely or precisely in our conversations. And I think from my perspective, the interest for today is that we will have a number of those layers revealed by speakers, panelists, and in the breakout rooms. What do I mean by that? I mean that all of you will be aware of individuals or businesses who have had particular experiences within the global supply chain ecosystem. Similarly, you'll have seen in media and through other reports, comments by industries about the impacts of supply chain on production, movement of goods, satisfaction of contracts, etc., etc. What we have in our presentation today, however, is a review, if you like, of the economy-wide features of supply chain as they apply to particular categories of goods. The terms used in the report are vulnerable, essential, critical, and that really, if you like, segregates the focus of the report from some of the other ideas that I've discussed just now. Having said that, however, it forms an integral part, if you like, of the discussion of supply chains. So the differentiated views that hopefully will be revealed today, I think will probably be a great learning experience for us all. And I commend the topic and the speakers to you. I could, of course, talk for a very long time and probably in the same vein in order to expand on some of these points, but we have people who are far better qualified on the event to do so. And on that note, I will hand over to Nancy, who will introduce our presenters from the Productivity Commission. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Bill, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. On behalf of the University of South Australia and UniSA Business, I want to welcome you to our forum today and say how much I appreciate you taking the time to be part of this exciting presentation. UniSA as a university is known as the University of Enterprise, and also known for the strong research partnerships that we build for evidence-based, impactful research. The robust research activity in UniSA Business has grown through the organization of our research concentration centers and affiliated institutes. Today, we see a great example. The Center for Enterprise Dynamics and Global Economies, co-led by Alan O'Connor and Shruti Sandashmak. Today, that center is partnering with professionals in international trade, BDO Australia, and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry to present a discussion about Australia's global supply chains, risk and resilience. Well, by now, you will know that I do not have an Australian accent, but indeed a Canadian one. And I have the pleasure of introducing our two guest speakers, but I also want to introduce Professor Susan Freeman, who is instrumental in organizing the forum today. So I'd like to begin by introducing Catherine de Fontenay, who commenced as a full-time commissioner with the Productivity Commission on the 1st of July, 2019. Catherine completed her PhD in 1998 at Stanford University, and she's had a number of instructional and research roles at universities such as the University of Melbourne, Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research from Stanford University, and the Stern School of Business at New York University. Most recently, Catherine was an associate professor of economics at the Melbourne Business School, University of Melbourne. Catherine's research has been published in a number of international journals and high-ranking journals, including the American Economic Review, the Rand Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Industrial Economics. Catherine's currently working on the firm entry and credit research, as well as the bequest research study. Joining Catherine today is Jonathan Coppel, who was appointed as full-time commissioner from July 2011 to July 2021, and is currently a special advisor. Jonathan is an economist with extensive international and domestic experience advising governments on trade, investment, energy, environmental, regulatory, and macroeconomic policy. I was very interested to read that prior to his current appointment, Jonathan was head of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD G20 Sherpa office, and during his career with OECD held senior roles as counselor to the chief economist, executive manager of the New Partnership for Africa, OECD Africa Investment Initiative, head of the EU and UK desk, and an analyst at the International Energy Agency. There is no shortage of qualifications here today. And in Australia, Jonathan has held senior management positions at the Reserve Bank and started his career at the Commonwealth Treasury. Now, for the sake of continuity, I'm going to continue with the third introduction and introduce my colleague, Susan Freeman. Professor Susan Freeman is a specialist in international business and has been a really valued mentor for the Center for Enterprise Dynamics and Global Economies at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in UniSA Business. Susan holds a PhD from Monash University in Australia, specializing in international business and international marketing. And Susan has more than 25 years of experience in the field, working with managers, governments, and industry bodies. And her industry experience has been a key driver of impactful research, looking at global startups across global supply chains, innovation, and new product development. Susan advises on the Asian region with leading service providers, especially Australian professional service organizations. Susan consults with large industry organizations such as the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the UK Trade and Investment on key issues facing business, providing data-driven reports and policy recommendations, all of which is relevant to our strategic change management processes in global supply chains. So Susan is the lead author of the 2021 ACCI National Trade Survey Industry Report that was commissioned by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So following presentations by Catherine and Jonathan from their respective roles with the Productivity Commission, Professor Freeman will moderate the discussions in regards to global supply chain issues faced by business owners and those business owners who participated in the survey that informed key research results. So without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Catherine and Jonathan, who will take us through the next part of today's program.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Can everyone hear me? Great.
Yes, we can, Catherine.
Just wanted to say what a huge pleasure it is to be able to present our work and to hear about the lived experience of supply chains from such an eminent group. Could we have the slides, please? So the government tasked the Productivity Commission with undertaking a study of Australia's vulnerable supply chains, and in particular, vulnerabilities that were particularly of concern to the country as a whole. Sorry, Ben, is it possible to get the slides?
Mike, are you there? Can you put the slides up, or do you need me? Just bear with us, keep talking, Catherine.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Next slide, thank you very much. So Jonathan and I were the commissioners assigned to this study. Oh, sorry, one slide back. Thank you. So essentially, we were asked to see what were the supply chains that were vulnerable to disruptions. And in particular, vulnerabilities tend to come from having a concentrated source of supply, a limited number of firms or a limited number of countries. Now, it's not enough for supply chains to be vulnerable for us to be worried about that. So many of us as consumers have experienced delays in the last 18 months. But if a sofa is late, that may not be of great concern to Australia. The question is, are there vulnerabilities in essential industries, goods and services that are essential to the needs of Australians? And then the last question is, are these elements from our supply chains critical? Are they inputs that we cannot do without in producing these essential goods and services? So with this three-part approach, we looked at global trade data to identify whether there were some key vulnerabilities for Australia. Next slide, please. So we were asked to look at both Australia's imports and Australia's exports. I'm just going to talk you through the logic of what we did on the import side. Next slide, thanks. So Australia has about 5,800 categories of imported goods. Of those categories of goods, the first question we asked was, is our supply concentrated? So does more than 80% of our supply come from one country? So then that leaves about a fifth of our imports as coming from a highly concentrated source. And that has been a source of some discussion in a number of research reports that Australia might be highly dependent on one source of supply. But that's actually not quite enough to be profoundly concerned. The question for us has to be, are we dependent on one source of supply, and are there no alternatives? So the next filter that we looked at was, is the world trade in this product concentrated? So is it the case that there's one country in the world that supplies 50% of the world with this particular import? Or through other measures, is this a highly concentrated market? So then again, only about a third of those concentrated imports met this definition. And the idea would be, yes, we get a lot of our supply from one country, perhaps a near neighbor, but actually there's a number of other countries that could supply us. And the last question is Australia being supplied from that one big provider? And so using these three filters, we went from 5,800 imports categories to only about 292, where we are vulnerable in the sense that our supply is highly concentrated and comes from one country. And so that leaves only about $20 billion of value as opposed to $287 billion of value. Next slide, please. So of those 292 vulnerable imports, the next question to ask is, which ones are being used in essential industries? And as economists, the answer is always, it depends. So it depends on your definition of what is an essential industry. The first perspective we looked at was essential industries in the sense of essential to life and limb in Australia. What do we need to provide health, to provide water, to provide food, to provide energy, and so on? So if we restrict our attention to sort of essential industries, we find that only 137 of those imports are being used in significant quantities in these essential industries. So that's about 2% of our imports. If instead you take a sort of broader view and you want to look at economically important industries, one perspective you might take is which of those imports are being used in our major export industries. So are there certain chemicals that we need for mining, for example? And what we find is about 66 of those imports are being used in our major export industries. So what you can see, oh, sorry, that's my dog. So what you can see is that from a very broad set of imports, we actually end up with just a very small category of imports that are vulnerable and being used in essential industries. The next slide, please. The next question that we might ask is, what are imports that are critical? Sorry, could we have the next slide, please? Thanks. Sorry, so what are those vulnerable imports? What we find is that the main ones are chemicals, so basic chemical products that are used in the production of medicines in Australia, that are used in a number of other health processes, and some used potentially in mining. And PPE. So obviously there has been much discussion of vulnerabilities in PPE during this current crisis, but we do find that there's a highly concentrated supply of some of those elements of PPE. It's worth bearing in mind that these vulnerable imports are a tiny share of costs in these essential industries, but that doesn't tell us whether these industries can do without them in their production. So the final step, next slide please, would be to ask which of these inputs are critical. And if you look at our list of these vulnerable imports, some of them you can exclude through common sense. We can probably, our education industry uses Christmas decorations, but that probably isn't something that they can. I'm thinking that Nancy could probably run her department without Christmas decorations this year if she had to. So we can exclude some using common sense, but at the moment, the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet is undertaking discussions with industry experts to identify which of these vulnerable imports are actually critical to key industries. I'll turn over next to Jonathan, and we'll go to the next slide to discuss the export side.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to first run through our findings on the export side, and then I'm going to finish off with a few remarks on the policy implications for supply chain risk management from our analysis. If we can go to the next slide. So I'm sure all of you are no doubt aware that Australia's exports are concentrated by market and by product. Perhaps, however, you're less aware that Australia isn't exceptional in its geographic and product concentration. And this slide attempts to illustrate that. So in the top panel, we show that in 2019, Australia's top 10 destination markets accounted for about 79% of exports, and this is by value, which is only a little bit higher than the global average of 71.5%. Similarly, in the bottom panel, we look at the top 10 exported products, and here Australia accounts for about 68% of all exports by value, and that contrasts with the global average of about 71%. We can go to the next slide. Here we outline how we identify which exports are vulnerable to disruption, and we use a very similar framework to the one that Catherine just outlined. We can go back one with respect to the analysis of imports. So we begin with the 4,900 exported products, looking at the 6-digit level, and we filter those products according to 3 levels of concentration. An exported good will be considered vulnerable when it's sold primarily to a single country, and here we use an 80% threshold. That's the first filter. And then when that country is also the main global purchaser of a good is the second filter that we apply. And the third is when Australia's biggest destination market is also the biggest importer, which is the third filter. And when we do this, starting with the first filter, there are in most years about 900 products where the biggest destination market for Australian exports accounts for over 80% of the exported product, and that's about 1 in 5 products. When we apply the second filter, we reduce that number down to about 380 in most years, and applying the third filter, where we check if Australia's biggest market is also the world's biggest buyer. We do that, so if it is disrupted, we'd have a greater difficulty finding alternative buyers if the disrupted market is the largest in a global sense. So when we apply those 3 filters, we're left with about 60 products, and that's around about 1% of all products. And then at this point, we also applied a 4th filter, which was designed really to remove any fluctuations in demand from year to year, reflecting the fact that Australia is very much a commodity dependent for most of its exports, and commodities are very vulnerable to quite sharp price modifications through the year. So what we've done is we've chosen to classify products as vulnerable if they get captured in the first 3 filters over a period of 4 or more of the 8 years that we analysed. And then using all of these criteria, we ended up with about 35 products that are classified as vulnerable. We can go to the next slide. Here we go through what represents those vulnerable exported products. And vulnerable exports made up overall about a quarter of the value of goods exported in 2019. That's a high figure. It's a high figure because iron ore is one of those vulnerable products. It's also Australia's most valuable export. If you were to take out iron ore, vulnerable exports would represent only about 1.5% of the value of goods exports. And some of the other products that are in that 1.5% include things like rock lobsters, timber and bauxite. Of the vulnerable exports that have been identified through this framework, about 80% of them go to China. And again, most of that, of course, is iron ore. We can go to the next slide. We look at a little bit at what Australian service exports are vulnerable to disruptions. And here we're unable to apply the same framework as we did for goods, both on the import side and on the export side. And that's limited by the limitations of the data that are available. But we were able to look at Australia's top 2 service exports, both education and tourism. And using those filters, neither of those 2 services were identified as vulnerable using the framework and the settings that we used. But you've got to remember that the framework is built around identifying vulnerability based on markets being concentrated on a particular export market, and whether there is the availability of alternative markets. So the problems that are currently facing the tourism and education sectors are not driven by either of those factors, but they are vulnerable in a broader sense, as many of you are no doubt aware. Indeed, they've been very severely hit by the border closures that have been introduced to limit the spread of COVID. And this is a very important point, especially when thinking about how the PC's framework can be used. Context clearly matters here. If we go to the next slide, just want to run through how we've used this conceptual framework to assess in very broad terms the economic impacts from a disruption to Australia's exports. And we've considered the recent trade bans imposed by China on select Australian products. The size of the impacts is going to depend on how quickly the market adjusts, which in turn will also depend on the nature of the product. So, for example, products like coal, which are not identified as vulnerable, new markets were quickly found as supplies were diverted to countries like India, Vietnam, South Korea, and even Brazil. And that you can see through the left-hand panel chart, where the light blue bars gradually disappeared close to zero, but that was made up by an increase in the blue bars. And part of that increase in the blue bars, or the bars overall, was linked to the fact that coal prices over this period picked up. So that also helped to restore some of the previous value of Australian coal exports. Other products, however, such as rock lobsters, which were identified as vulnerable, have had a much harder time. They took a big price hit when they diverted a lot of the product to the domestic market. So clearly, the difficulty that exporters face in expanding to alternative markets is a function of many factors, and not all of those factors are captured in the analysis of global trade data. For instance, the costs of finding new customers will likely be smaller for standardized commodity products like coal than they are for differentiated products like wine, which require added service, added value from marketing and the development of the reputation of a particular producer. So again, context matters, and it particularly matters for how the PC's conceptual and analytical framework are applied and interpreted. We go to the next slide. This is where I'd like to shortly finish up by drawing out a few of the implications of our analysis for the role of government in supply chain risk management. Now, our conclusion is that most of Australia's supply chains for imports and exports are sufficiently diversified to make them resilient to disruptions, and that suggests that government should not intervene in most supply chains. However, governments do have responsibility, like any firm, to manage the risks in supply chains where they purchase or deliver goods and services directly, and especially for those goods and services which are considered to be essential. Government intervention in private sector risk management may also be justified when society's tolerance for the residual risk is lower than that resulting from the market, and where government impediments or other impediments prevent firms from effectively managing the risks. There's also a role there for government to put in place the enabling conditions to facilitate private firm effective management of their risks. So there are a number of roles for government in the area of supply chain risk management. If we can go to the next slide, this shows that there are a number of strategies that governments can use to prepare for a supply chain disruption. They include things like better planning and information, stockpiling, diversification of markets and suppliers, contingent contracting, and domestic production. And the point I really want to make is that no one strategy will entirely protect from the risk of disruption. If we can go to the next slide. And another point, another important point, is that government intervention can also crowd out private investment in risk management. It's a simple point, but even where in principle there is a case for government intervention, it's also important that it be demonstrated that the net benefits of any intervention outweigh the costs. And our report provides some guidance on how to assess the trade-offs of investing in risk management strategies. And ultimately, it boils down to tracing through the trade-offs between the costs of a disruption on the one hand with the opportunity costs of investing in risk management on the other. Often there seems to be a presumption that domestic manufacturing capability is the ideal solution. Yet we comment in the report that subsidies to establish a sovereign capacity may not always be cost effective or suitable for mitigating some types of disruptions. For example, if if there's a domestic capacity built for refining fuels, that may not be an effective solution when there's a disruption in the sourcing of the crude oil to refine those fuels, which emanates from overseas. So once again, context matters. Thank you. Catherine and I are very happy now to take questions. We've tried to cover a lot in just 20 minutes. And so we've jumped over a number of some of the details that can be found in the report, and that may also be a possible source of questions in terms of the detail on what we did and how that bore on the results that we got.
If I may, Susan.
Yes, I'm happy.
Well, I was going to say it may give an opportunity for the panelists to engage directly with Jonathan and Catherine as well as with you. So
absolutely, very comfortable to do that. We might take the slides down and perhaps just focus on the key speakers. So that would be Catherine and Jonathan, and also to have Annette Katanis, and also David Garm, Liz Hollingdale, and also Richard Dolan. I'll spend a few moments now introducing our panel. But before I do, I'd just like to formally thank Catherine and also Jonathan for a very stimulating and very informed coverage. Before we move to our discussion, I think it's very important to separate two factors. And one that is important to understand that there are disruptions that we do not want government interference with, because it distorts the supply that would otherwise manage to recorrect itself. There's also a distinction that needs to be made when the distortions are actually caused by the government. And that's something that I'm going to be looking at with the panel. In this case, border closures and grants and subsidies that are given that have impact that perhaps was not intended. But before I preempt the discussion that will follow, I'd like to just take a few moments to welcome our panel. First of all, I'd like to welcome Annette. Annette Kataninis is the co-founder of Scoot Boots. They manufacture and export equine hoof boots across the globe. And since Scoot Boots was founded, Annette has taken this business from a startup phase into global growth. It has approximately 500 active stocks across the globe and is growing. And it has won a myriad of awards in its short history. In 2018, Scoot Boots was the Telstra Emerging and Energised winner for Tasmania, which is where it's based. It was the Telstra Tasmanian Business of the Year. Again, in 2018, it was the Telstra National Award winner for the Emerging and Energised category of business awards, as well as the e-commerce export winner. In the same year, Annette was also a finalist in the Telstra Women's Business of the Year Awards for small businesses. In 2019, they were again the e-commerce export winner, and Annette was again a finalist in the Telstra Women's Business of the Year Awards. And in 2021, this year alone, they are the Exporter of the Year winner for the Tasmania Information, Communication and Technology area. Annette was born in Tasmania, has spent approximately 18 years in Melbourne. Her background is a legal career and litigation lawyer before beginning this business. And I warmly welcome her to the panel and thank her very much.
Thank you, Susan.
I'd now like to welcome David Garn. David Garn is or holds from Queensland, although the company RXMX is actually based in New South Wales, which again indicates how people are moving around in the current environment that we find ourselves in. David is the Chief Commercial Officer, but also oversees marketing and product development for RXMX, and it's a major pharmaceutical industry participant across global markets. David previously acted as the founding CEO of RXMX for 4 years, and he was really responsible for spearheading and managing the expansion of operations to ensure the company could capitalise at this all-important phase in Australia, in European countries and US to take up the opportunities. He was instrumental in the company's rapid rise and growth and cultivated a very internationally collaborative culture, which is quite well recognised among their employees. He has a wealth of pharmaceutical industry experience and previously responsible for developing brand plans for international adaptation, as well as driving the introduction and success of all sorts of blockbuster drugs and therapies. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Susan.
I'd now like to take this moment to introduce Liz. Liz Hollingdale is the CEO and the major owner of Pool Controls, which is a West Australian-based manufacturer of swimming pools and sanitation equipment. This is a family-owned business, and Pool Controls sells its products across Australia and New Zealand, and they are attempting to export markets and develop those into Europe and Southeast Asia. Liz is also currently heavily involved in the industry and is the president of the Swimming Pool and Spa Association of Western Australia, as the firm covers recreation, sports and tourism sectors. Prior to Pool Controls, Liz worked as a lawyer, first with Kingswood Nelson and then in-house with Bankwest when it was part of HBOS Australia. She has a Bachelor of Science specialising in organic chemistry and a law degree in honours from the University of Western Australia. Warmly welcome you, Liz, to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Finally, I would like to welcome Richard Dolan. Richard Dolan is from South Australia in the wine sector and is the co-owner of, with his wife, Beck Hardy, is the co-owner of Beck Hardy's. Today, he has let me know he is the winner of the Regional Export Company of the Year Award in the South Australia Premier's Export Awards. Congratulations to you both.
Thanks, Susan.
Yorkshire by birth and an Australian by choice. Richard is Joint Managing Director at Beck Hardy Wines with his wife, Beck. And before joining his wife in the wine industry in 2011, Richard worked for 20 years in financial services across 2 continents, UK and Australia, where he gained experience in finance, in operations, and sales and branding. And in 2020, amidst the middle of a pandemic, Beck and Richard took over the ownership running of the iconic Perdaringa brand in McLaren Vale, dearly known and well understood and enjoyed by many South Australians, if not nationals. So without further ado, I'd like to begin our discussion. As I said earlier, we've been informed by some extremely helpful information around vulnerabilities by classifying those vulnerabilities according to a framework that allows us to understand that on the one hand, we don't have a large number of products that appear to be vulnerable, but on the other hand, Australia's GDP and growth at the moment, according to recent statistics that were released earlier this year by the IMF, is that most of our growth is heavily reliant on the extraction industries, or more specifically, the energy sector. So when we're told that greater than 75% of our export earnings come from iron ore to China, that is concerning, and it is something to think about. But it's not the only industry that we're going to talk about today. And I think that what I'd like to do is throw open to the panel the discussion around such things as, well, what are some of the specific factors from a specific business point of view? Australia is not a United States of Australia. We have many different states with many different industries, and they are quite unrelated at times. And that gives us peculiar issues around managing internal and external factors, not only prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly intensified the impact of some of these issues. Now, as I said earlier, many companies are doing extremely well during this period, and that might be due, and they will let us know in a moment, due to a number of factors that are not related to COVID. Sometimes it relates to their industry, sometimes it relates to where they're located. But it's important to keep in mind today that there are a number of internal factors that are not within the control of firms that are making business quite challenging and distorting supply chains in ways that perhaps we haven't quite captured a macro factor, which is why we've got the micro voice of business with us today. Not to dispute what Catherine and Jonathan have told us, far from it, but to actually now give the firm-specific view of what it's really like. Things such as border closures and lockdowns, port and shipping locations, transport management to ports, port management, freight costs, air freight, customs and border controls, the enormous red tape and complexity of rules of getting goods in and out of Australia, and the marketing, trying to locate new customers and new product development. All of these are a mix that now businesses are being asked to deal with, both at an internal and also at a border level, externally, internationally, as well as internally. And we are living at a time now where many of the borders around the world are open. As you know, we have guests from France, from Eastern Europe, Italy, across into Iceland, New Zealand, and many of these economies are not behaving like we are. So we do need to understand who we are and what seems to be going on. So I'd like to begin, perhaps if I ask, if you don't mind, Richard, if I ask, particularly from where you're sitting in the wine sector, what are some of the things that are particular you're finding that are either working well, not working so well, and what would be helpful, either from a government point of view to back away, get out of the space, or what do we need at this specific time? It's all very well to say yes in the future, but right now, and certainly as we think about the next 5 to 10 years. Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody for the opportunity. Just acknowledging that I come to you all today from Ghana country, on which we're very privileged to live, work, and farm. What's working well? I think what's working well, certainly in our business, is the most overused word of 2021, aside from you're on mute, is really the pivoting. And where we've had some real success is really thinking differently. And because we can't get on those aeroplanes into international markets and spruik our wares, one of the things that we've done and had considerable success with is through the appointment of in-market representatives. So about a year ago, we put somebody on the ground in the US, and in fact, just today we landed a 10,000 case deal going into Costco. By give you some context of that, that's about a 25%.
Congratulations.
Thank you. That's about a 25% increase on our revenue from last year from that single deal. It's the second largest deal we've done certainly in 10 years, and the largest deal for Beck Hardy wines in the 15 months that we've been operating. So we're just about to replicate that model by putting somebody on the ground in the UK. So that's working well. But to Jonathan's point, pivoting is incredibly slow, particularly with value-added products, and particularly when you're precluded from being on aeroplanes. So that pivot is working, but slowly. In terms of international supply chains, one of the challenges that we're having right now is a 20% increase on the cost of oak barrels, and the length of time that the importation of those barrels is taken from France is a lot longer and be incredibly more expensive. So we'll be paying about $13,000 on a $50,000 budget for oak, over and above what we would have paid ordinarily. So significant percentage cost. It's just like, it really is that thinking differently. And I guess from an Australian industry perspective, wine is one of those industries that is the poster boy of fallout from that diplomatic stoush. And whilst some government funding, and both at state and federal level, has certainly assisted us in increasing our representation in international markets, I guess a lot of the solutions that are coming through from government are supply side led, essentially trying to encourage more producers to put more supply into more markets. And that really is only half the challenge. We really need to do a job in terms of creating demand in those markets so that we're actually getting some pull through on that product, because otherwise all we're really incentivizing is essentially a reverse auction. Many distributors and importers around the world know that Australian wine is in a significant oversupply problem because of the diplomatic fallout with China. And so therefore that's putting real downward pressure on prices. And remember that nobody was really paying more for Australian wine than the Chinese. That in and of itself, recognizing that really there is no solution to the wine industry's issues without China. Because if you take the next 20 markets for Australian wine, grow each of those markets by 20%, it still doesn't make up that shortfall of wine into China. So some assistance from federal government, particularly on building that demand for Australian wine, really selling the message of premium wine into some of those more traditional markets like the US, the UK, mainland Europe, would certainly be really beneficial, because that is something. If the role of government is to provide things that the private sector won't provide for itself, than really building demand for Australian wine and Australian premium agribusiness product more broadly in international markets really would be helpful.
Richard, that's been very helpful. I appreciate that. You really brought out those particulars. Annette, could I ask you to respond to the same question? From your point of view, what's been particularly frustrating and what's also working at the moment? What perhaps is escalating as time has gone by? Because from your point of view, when I last spoke, things were going relatively well, couldn't keep up with demand, but supply chain issues, this is 6 months later.
Yes, we've done quite well with our supply chain issues. What we've done is we've implemented some risk management strategies and we have stockpiled. That's not just our manufacturer, but we have actually stockpiled with product ourselves. So we've got a lot of money that is caught up with product that we brought in, which under ordinary circumstances we wouldn't have had to. So we've stockpiled here in our warehouse, we've stockpiled, our manufacturer has stockpiled product or raw material, I should say, thermoplastic urethane, which is what our product is made out of, as well as neoprene and other product that he normally gets from China. So we've been very lucky. We've got a forward-thinking manufacturer who has prepared for the environment and the economic climate that we're in at the moment. So we've been quite lucky last year and this year in relation to not having too many supply issues. We haven't had really any problems with border closures. We've actually, year on year, well, last year our revenue doubled to what we made the previous year, and again, this year is looking to be.
And is that because you're almost an online business? Is that why?
I think so, and we are predominantly a wholesale business where most of our sales, 90% of our sales is wholesale. So a lot of our product will go out of Indonesia from where our manufacturer is. We do a little bit of exporting ourselves here in Tasmania, but I think just being prepared and putting those strategies into place right at the outset, knowing that it was going to be a really bad year last year and this year, has held us in good stead with moving forward and without the product and being, as you say, online and being able to.
There's also the issue around having to put capital aside to hang on to this inventory too, isn't there?
Yes.
How long, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And TPU does have a shelf life as well. So we're very mindful of that. So we really got to move this product quickly, but still, be able to have sufficient amount to be able to keep us going just in case we do have those problems. I mean, we're mindful about the pandemic in Indonesia, in Jakarta, where we manufacture, and that's been quite worrying. But look, so
they're
far,
back on board manufacturing, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They never stopped. Fortunately, they weren't a manufacturing plant that wasn't closed down by the Indonesian government. So we've been very lucky there. And most of them now are double vaccinated, and they, of course, implement the strategies in the factory with social distancing, and a lot of the factory workers live on site anyway. So,
thank you, and that's been really helpful. I mean, Richard's talked about some of the issues of being able to build new customer links, needing open borders. You've talked about that issue of having to manage extra capital to stockpile to be able to manage those ups and downs with the supply chain at the moment. Extremely helpful to understand that. I'd now like to ask David to talk about the pharmaceutical industry in which he's in. David, can you talk a little about some of the issues that you're facing at the moment and what's been changing, perhaps even prior to COVID and now what it's like with COVID and what you'd like to see change? You just have to take yourself off mute, David. Thank you.
So is that better?
Much better.
So thanks very much, Susan. I mean, our company is a very interesting one. We are a fully remote company and have been for the last sort of 6 years. That then obviously had a huge reliance on international travel. Pre-COVID, I was overseas probably 6 to 8 months of the year, especially just before COVID hit. We have a significant number of staff in the US and in Europe. And working with the pharmaceutical industry, these are global businesses. They have global head offices, and there's decision makers who attend, conferences and medical events. And obviously, they want to see in the pharma industry. They really do want to see who you are. They want to see your technology. They want to see how you can service them. And honestly, the first 6 months of COVID was fantastic because I hadn't been at home for that long, and my family really appreciated me being around. But after that, we probably had one of our quietest years in 2020 because of the pharma industry was really struggling with what the impact of COVID was on their patients and how they work with that. But since the turn of this year, there's a huge tailwind, obviously, towards digital health and technology and how information can be supported through the distribution of, applications and physician-based materials. And it's been a really big year for us this year. We're really quite looking to expand rapidly through the US and Australia and also Europe. They're our major markets. We sort of deal with top 5 European countries, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the US and Canadian North American markets are the major pharmaceutical markets, plus here in Oz. But
so David, from your specific point of view, what do you need? Do you need those borders open?
Borders to open. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I need the borders to open. The customers want to see us. I still am the primary salesperson around the complexity of the products that we actually sell. And I've got staff that I've never met and never trained in person. And I think everyone understands the difficulties with that. And long-term meetings on Zoom, you can't build meaningful relationships with our customers or our staff. So, I mean, honestly, we need that borders open locally in terms of state-based travel, and we really do need the borders internationally opened as soon as possible to get across there.
Very helpful, David, because what we're hearing is a business here that is fully online. And even with fully online businesses, there's still the importance of personal contact. And I think that's what's missing from much of the research. We forget that growth in firms is a result of customers, and that particularly when you're pivoting away, in the case of David, he's not pivoting away from markets that have been highlighted this afternoon as risk, but actually trying to build new customer supply chains. So this is something that is certainly an issue. I know Bill has a question, but I'd like to just, if I could, move to discussion quickly with Liz. Is that all right, Bill? Okay, Liz.
I was gonna say, sorry to interrupt it all, but I've got an urgent itch that needs to be scratched by Catherine and Jonathan. We've had a couple of examples here where government intervention takes a policy form that is not economic in its action per se. It's about political decisions enabling economic outcomes. It would be, I'd love to hear a comment from other Productivity Commission representatives on that element in their thinking, in their model.
Jonathan, Catherine, would you like to respond to the question from Bill before I go across to Liz?
I'm not sure there's an easy answer. So governments are obviously concerned about shocks that impact businesses. I don't know. So obviously with the freight assistance mechanism, so subsidies to air travel, there's been specific attempts to support sectors that were particularly affected by the disruption of air travel. Whether it makes sense to have a distinction between a rule that government had to put in because of a pandemic, which it was not responsible for, is a difficult question. Jonathan?
Yeah. I wanted to emphasise and make sure I went across the work that we've done, the framework we've done, acts as a tool. It isn't going to be one that on its own can identify all sources of vulnerability. It is quite specific. I mentioned, for example, education and tourism, two services that are not identified as vulnerable, but also services themselves are not able to be really looked at in the same way as we have been able to do for goods. And certainly when it comes to transportation shipping, that is an essential service to the effective functioning of Australia's supply chains, but it's not something that we can pick up because of those data limitations. I think it's also been pointed out that there have been a number of government interventions. Susan made the point that there are a number of government interventions that can be the source of the disruption to supply chains, and that can manifest in higher prices. And in the case of freight, those prices have really skyrocketed, and for air freight, essentially it was just the market was pulled out from under their feet. But I do come back, given that point, that it is and remains important when assessing the options for intervention to look at all of those options. Some of those options may build in too much redundancy and come at a very high cost. Others may be just looking at the regulations that are limiting the movement of people, essential people, within Australia's own borders because of health restrictions. Those two can make a contribution and may be a more cost-effective contribution. So the point we're really making is that we need to take a more holistic approach. Yeah.
No, I think it's very helpful as we try to move between those macro and those micro factors here, industry level as well as firm level. We can't separate them and they are intertwined. Just like to go across to Liz now. Liz, from a Western Australian point of view, and particularly in a sector that imports a lot of chemicals, which I know that Jonathan and Catherine alluded to earlier, what's been happening in your sector? And in particular, what's been working well, what's now starting to really cause particular issues, and what would you like done?
Well, I think I'd probably touch on the point you just made, that there's a hell of a lot going on at the micro level. At the moment, I feel that Western Australia is a separate country, so I export to the other states, feeling very isolated at times. But we manufacture electronic devices, and we have a lot of intricate, quite micro sort of components. And the problem is that you only need one of those components to be missing, and your business can grind to a halt. So a relatively small thing that certainly wouldn't rate on the vulnerability assessment framework can pose an existential threat to my business. And I suspect that there are several businesses that could be literally wiped out by something really rather small happening. And what that means is that at the micro level, we fight for these little things. And probably because we have to, and we divert so much energy and attention to issues that government couldn't possibly be across or do anything about, we're actually probably far more likely to get what we need. If we don't, we won't be here. So that sort of is proof, I suppose, of what goes on. One comment I would make is that our suppliers in foreign countries, I'm talking here on the import side of things, and that very complex supply web, if you like, because it's not even as simple as a chain. They are also very eager to make it work. So I have to compliment our suppliers in their, ability to be flexible and pivot in our own little way.
Liz, when you say that, do you mean that there seems to be more tolerance for people to be doing whatever they can to make these work? Because everyone knows how difficult it is.
I think there has to be, if you maintain an inflexible and rigid, and you're totally incapable of pivoting at all, you're just not going to survive. I think it has come down to the why. I mean, and I say that I've been the beneficiary, I feel, of some of the measures that the government has seen fit to impose upon us. Getting everyone to stay at home has meant they're far more likely to put a swimming pool in and buy one of my machines. And my business is our revenue's almost doubled, and our big struggle has been getting sufficient supplies in the door.
Well, there's a lovely example of the unintended consequences of government policy, which I think.
Oh, look, I like to think that Scott Morrison had me in mind, but I fear not. But yeah, it is interesting. I think also can't get us away from the fact that the stimulus measures that, the financial stimulus that was injected into the economy the money has to go somewhere. And I think people aren't, and my particular industry has almost certainly benefited from that increased discretionary spend. So,
yes, I'm going to say thank you at that point, because we need to move on, and I'd like to thank you very much for those specific points. I'd now like to thank the panel again, and also to Jonathan and Catherine. Before I hand over to Ben to explain to us, we're now going to move into...
Oh no, Brian, sorry, Susan.
Oh, sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Brian has to... Brian, can you do a summary of the discussions from Catherine and Jonathan and the panel discussions? Please take it away, Brian.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you to all of the speakers, and Susan and Jonathan and Catherine. It's been an interesting discussion, and clearly we're just scratching the surface here. I know the Productivity Commission did a great report. It's a hefty tome of a report to be having a look at. So I do commend people to spend a little bit of time going through that, at least going through the recommendations and the executive summary of it, if you don't have time to get too far beyond that. But it's highlighted a number of things to us, and the same thing with the panel speakers, many of whom, or all in fact of whom, were respondents in our trade survey. And I thank them very much for their response to that earlier in the year as well. And a lot of this conversation has reinforced things that we heard previously, but perhaps has also started to think of a few other things. And I will try to be short, because I know that we're over time here, but I think some key points which was brought out to me is Jonathan in particular was highlighting that vulnerability needs context. It's, well, who's looking at this? Is it the government who is trying to deal with the big stuff? And we've obviously seen a lot of businesses impacted at the moment because health has overridden supply chain and business needs particularly, and businesses have had to cope with that. We've heard some have been disrupted badly, some have been disrupted very positively by that as well. Now, whether or not those things will reverse, we'll have to see over time. But obviously, in that same context to the supply chain vulnerabilities, individuals and individual businesses are much more vulnerable in their own financial situation, as opposed to nationally vulnerable, which is what the sort of Productivity Commission was looking at as well. So we've got other issues which have gone on too, and this panel conversation has highlighted a few things too, which maybe if we did have a minute or two, Jonathan or Catherine might like to just draw upon too, which was the aspects around supply chain vulnerability, not necessarily from the exact sectors, but from the component suppliers, and where you've got a deep integration with somebody who's in another country that's dealing with your supply chains, your customer satisfaction and other things there too. So that Australia may have particular aspects of that, but once you build on that and you look at the other players, maybe there are other vulnerabilities, and I'd be interested to know how the Productivity Commission may have looked at some of those aspects. The other things which have drawn out today is the lack of people-to-people contact. So one of the serious vulnerabilities is just the ability to have a relationship. And we perhaps haven't looked at those things too. You know, we've looked at the material components of it, but the inability, and the longer this goes on, that you can't travel, that you can't meet your customers, that you can't engage with your staff and know who these things are, that sets up a different set of vulnerabilities, and maybe that's further opportunity for conversations to be had for us. And the last point really around the vulnerabilities is, where does government play a role? You know, how is it that government can actually assist? Obviously, government has very negatively impacted this by the imposition and prioritisation of health over supply chains. But then you've got, you know, whether or not some aspects, you don't want to see the government intervening in the marketplace in a detrimental way. But we've also heard calls where the government might be able to actually assist with industries building up, you know, the reputational points or the interest points in new markets and other things with the industry can act alone. So I pulled out just a few solutions potentially that we can leave ourselves with or have for further discussion, but it's moving on government intervention is that we need a helping hand, not a handout, in the broad sense for things. We need help with new markets, but not intervention in the market. We clearly need to open the borders, and that call has been around for a very long time, but we still have to balance that with the health needs. And as we move forward with our vaccination programs, hopefully we've now got at least a candle at the other end of the tunnel, but hopefully a bigger set of light than that. Businesses need to focus on the little things. You know, the individuals and the businesses here, there's, I think it was Liz who said those things, it's just the component supply. You know, it's all very well, you can put the whole of the package inside the box, but if you haven't got the end cap, you know, to make it work, the thing won't, you can't sell it, for example. We've heard that before with hand sanitizer in the initial phases of the pandemic, where all of the chemicals, you know, those were being sorted out and made available, and then you couldn't get bottles to put it into, or you couldn't get the pump packs. You've got to have the whole of the package or you can't sell it. We've also heard how important imports are. We have a lot of this conversation around what exports are doing, but it's imports that are actually really important to that too. There are no exports without imports. We have to reinforce that time and time again, is you need both sides of this coin for it to work properly. And the thing I'll leave you with is also the great commentary around the need for agile skills development. Businesses have learned a lot through this experience. They've become used to dealing with these things, but it's new sets of skills they never thought they'd have to have, or, you know, perhaps only used in a minor way. Now they've had to be much more accentuated in the way that they've dealt with those in their agile performance. So look, I've found it a really interesting conversation, but I think we're just scratching the surface. I hope people can stay on for some of the individual chat sessions, but thank you very much to everybody, and thank you for Professionals in Trade and the Productivity Commission for giving your time and support today as well.
Thank you, Brian. I'd like to thank everyone that's participated in today's webinar. My name's Ben, I'm a trademark attorney at Fontenay Partners, but today I'm representing Professionals in International Trade. I've actually been a member since 2018 and have sat on the board in 2019 as the head of marketing and communications. And I welcome everyone on this webinar to join us as members. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We will put the LinkedIn link in the chat room, and also we will also put the registration link for you to join us as official members. There's a lot of very varied professionals and companies that are members of Professionals in International Trade. And we will now move into our network working rooms. And the reason why we want to do networking is because we've just heard from everyone that we lack this interaction with other people. And with this webinar, I'd like to thank Catherine and Jonathan, Susan, University of South Australia, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and BDO for partnering with us. So we're about to move into the networking rooms. And the purpose of these networking rooms is for you to be able to introduce yourself within 45 seconds, tell everyone what you do and which company you're in working for, and really to take the discussion further in the rooms about the problems within supply chains or lack of problems within the supply chains, but I'm sure there's more problems there than there's not. So now I will ask Hasaifa, if you could, actually, first of all, I'd like to thank Hasaifa Ahmed. He's been doing all the technical aspects of running this webinar, so you're doing a fantastic job. Could you now please take us into the breakout rooms? So you'll have a screen that'll come up to say you're going to be allocated a breakout room, and all you need to do is click join, and magically you'll be transported into the breakout rooms. So Hasaifa, can you press the button? Thank you. Okay, I think I can stop the recording now.
Remarkable technology.
Yeah, well, I'm not that good, so I've got to stop this recording.